really set out to make a film. I really have filmed Ida for many years. I always go to the mounting of her exhibitions, and being a filmmaker, I bring my camera with me. And so it was really just a process of, you know, I would document her, film her here, film her there, over the course of many, many years. And as you see in the film, a lot of different formats, starting with high 8, so it was a while ago. And then at a certain point, I started to realize that I really needed to make a film about her. Her work, you know, has inspired me since a very young age, and I love her personality. And there was a story that I thought was really important that needed to be told. And many of my films are really about voicing the unheard and seeing the unseen. And I felt like it was critically important to do a little excavation. And as Ida started to, you know, after a while of filming, after a time of filming, I, you know, came to a point where she kept saying to me, "You've been filming and filming, you have more than enough. Stop filming, stop, you don't need to film anymore." And at that point, I said, you know, I really don't have the film that I need to have. I don't have the footage. And it was really because I felt the excavation that I felt was really important, that Ida was not willing to.
That's an understatement.
She was not willing to go there. And then finally, when Documenta came in 2013, Ida started to really look at her journals. And as she says in the beginning of the film, what is it? There are...
personal things are no longer sacred once I make them public.
Yes, so once she made those public, and they were very, very private, I said, okay, if you're making them public here, can you make them public for the film? And that really opened things up, and she said, okay, pick something you want me to read from the journals. And I knew exactly which ones to pick. I knew which, out of journals and journals she had, the green dress was, to me, that was, in some ways, the catalyst for her to claim herself as an individual, as an artist, and it was critically important to have that as really the centerpiece of the film. And that's when I knew.
But also, also something I've never talked about, not to my family, not to anyone else. And the first time that I did talk about it was actually on camera when Beth asked me that question. And it was shocking to me because obviously I was able to do it. It's still shocking to me when I watch it again. But the nice part about this film generally that I wanted to say was that it took her 15 years, and I was positive this film would never be made in my lifetime. To me, it can't be the age I am, 86, almost 87, 3 years away from 90. I was positive I would never see it, and it was very comfortable for me to do all this with her. That's your point. Really sure. Say it to whatever I want. I'll never get to see it.
But as soon as I got what I wanted to get, no, as soon as it was really, an opening up from that point, from 2013, everything kind of opened up, and there was more willingness, I think, because the process of making a film is so much about trust, and even though I, feel so close to Ida, there are things, and boundaries, there are boundaries, and it was, I think, sometimes very complicated and conflicting for me because, as a director, it's my job to draw out things from my subject, but I wasn't just a director, I was also a daughter and a colleague and one of my best friends, Ida is, and so it was much more challenging to figure out how to manage and how far to push things. And as you can see, there were times, I probably have about 15 or 20 times when Ida told me to turn the camera off. Or she walked out of the room.
Or I would take it to court. She didn't Berlin.
That's true, yes.
But you decided to leave those boundaries there, so at points you come in and out of focus, we hear your voice, we don't hear your voice, we see you at different points, but then you also, we have Ida saying, you're in the way, Beth. Yeah. So you kind of, you let this kind of uncomfortable, you know, when it gets a bit prickly and difficult, you wanted to leave this in the film.
Yes, I mean, I think it's important. It's what adds to the complexity of it and the layered sensibility. And
actually, Joe, you gave it away tonight.
Oh, yes.
We don't usually mention that she's my daughter and her mother. The film starts out essentially, people don't know that we're mother and daughter for the most part.
Okay.
Even when we were in New York and the art world, it was very, very rare.
So the big reveal comes in the Q&A.
And Joe gave it away.
Sorry.
We got that strangely in Berlin. They were like, well, we thought you were this, and we thought the relationship was that, and then we thought this, and you know, and then it's sort of this interesting but it's fine. It's it's how, every screening, that's what's exciting, is every screening is entirely different.
I guess, and for me coming to it knowing this before I'd seen it was what made it just so kind of powerful, because this dynamic of collaboration is very different when it's family. But you've collaborated previously, right? Is it Belladonna? And I mean, you've worked together previously, but this is a very different kind of relationship.
It's not a collaboration.
Yeah, I'll tell you one little funny story. I thought it was kind of funny. Actually, it was terrifying at first. Then it ended up being funny, but I was, getting closer to the film being finished. I, really started editing it in earnest, and, I was telling Ida, I'm so excited about it, and it's coming on. She said, well, I want to make sure that I get to see it, and if there's anything that I don't like or want in it, you'll have to cut it out. And I kind of, I tried not to react right then and there. And I said, well, let me think about it. And I went home that night and, I got back to my editing. And I started to edit, and I realized I couldn't edit. Because in my head, I kept thinking, is she going to like this? Is she going to be, will I get her approval for that? And it really stopped my creative process, because I wanted to please her. She's my mother. And and so then I went back the next day, and I said, I don't think I can allow that. I think that I need to be able to edit it the way I see it, and the truth that it is for me, and hopefully you'll like it and love it. Would have been, impossible to finish the film. So luckily, you didn't call your lawyer. You said,
No.
because it is trust again.
Yes, yes, absolutely. We could keep going here, but let's see if anyone has any questions or comments from the audience.
Yeah, thank you so much. I really thought it was so special that you shared these very personal and private insights with us. I was particularly intrigued by the example of Manet and the Olympia which you engaged, and I was wondering whether you could tell us a bit more about your take on beauty, because with Manet's Olympia, your interpretation seemed a bit as if you kind of links this beauty with the self-determination of the woman and this kind of self-decidedness, but then later you said beauty is just about views. So does beauty have
just about
like a deep
I missed your...
You said, but then later she said beauty is about what?
About views.
Views, the gaze.
Yes.
The gaze.
So I was wondering whether you could tell us a bit more about your take on beauty and how it kind of determines or resonates in your work.
Yeah, we're talking about a time when, not just then, even when you think of the magazines that came out, Playboy and all the other magazines like it, what were you gazing at? They're so-called these porno magazines. Anytime you see a nude lady, it's a porno shot, whether it's a painting from Manet's time or whatever. And you're never seeing it for what the woman thinks about her. The woman looks out as though she's going to please the male gaze, while for me that was the first time looking at, and that was a big disgrace in those days, that Manet's Olympia was not looking to please the male gaze. she was just looking, you know, offhandedly. And that was in terms of something very, very different when a woman posed generally for any painting or any portrait, especially naked.
I was just, sorry, I lost my voice a bit, but I was wondering if you could say why you decided to go to your journals in 2013 for the Documenta exhibition.
You know, I no longer did the journals, and I did them for many, many years, and they were always in the studio, but I used them for reference when I wanted to do a piece and I needed some one-liners or putting together visual stuff. Then I would always use the journals. So the journals have always been with me. And then it didn't start out with doing the journals. It started out with something, I don't even remember what it was, but I remember being given a very large space in Documenta. And I was starting to put it together, because when you first start, I know that anyone who's really starting a work, they don't really know what they want to do. And if they think that they know what they want to do, look at it, you know, a month or two later, you realize, oh no, that's not at all, and you're someplace else, which is good, and thank goodness that that's going to happen that way. And that's pretty much what happened with Documenta, where the journal didn't enter into it at all. It was something totally different, and then it suddenly came together as the piece in Documenta.
And Beth, what about you? You knew that Ida was keeping the journals, or was this, how much of that was a revelation when you were talking and making the film? Because it felt like there was a lot of discoveries made as we were watching.
Yeah, when I filmed her, I think that sort of towards the beginning of the film, and she's looking through the journals, that, I mean, she had talked about the journals, but I had never seen them.
Okay.
Had you always had them in the studio, but I never saw them. You never really worked directly.
Well, I have everything under the sun in the studio.
Yes, it's packed.
You can see the studio is full of everything.
Yeah.
And I have this person called Andrew that follows me around and will not let me throw anything away. I have to throw something away, and he's not letting me tear it to shreds. So this has pretty much resolved that problem.
We made her excavate everything that we knew about. But it was a discovery process. I think a lot of the film was for me. And, you know, her kind of giving me, at some point, she gave me copies of the journals.
Okay.
And then I was able to read.
I gave you the journals, actually.
No, Emily Xeroxed them for me. I have Xerox versions of them. And because Andrew would never let those journals go out of the studio. So, and I read through them, and then that was a discovery process. But, you know, a lot of things in the film, you know, even like looking at that from the ad agency. You know, I didn't know that you had worked at an ad. I mean, maybe a long time ago I heard something about it, but that's what was the beauty also of all of this, is I feel like it was a very large excavation, and it continues to be.
And Ida's own surprise. You seemed surprised yourself looking back at things that you'd forgotten, and I think that card from the ad agency was a perfect example of this, something that you kind of, oh yeah, there was this thing.
Yeah.
But, I mean, seeing it now, this is a...
Well, it's the kind of thing where that was one of my first jobs, and when I went to school, I couldn't go to school, to regular art school. I had to go to a commercial art school so that I could make a living.
Mm-hmm.
And of course, what I did was I was training to be in an ad agency, and that's exactly what I did. And working for the ad agency, it was 1949, and it was like when we talk about the television series Mad Men. Later on, I realized it was Mad Men, but not quite as bad. But it was pretty much it was that. Yeah. But I realized also I forgot when I was telling her about it. I forgot, and I said, you know, when I left, and then I suddenly remembered, and I remember where I kept all that stuff, and I pulled it out, and then I was sort of shocked at the card itself. Everything had to do with marriage.
Yes.
And all these men were wonderful. They were lovely men, and everything that was in their head was all about marriage. And there were about 15 men working there at the time with me. And,
But 1949, and already this just feels like such a big feminist gesture. Like it's too, you can't tell people you're just going to another job, so I'll tell them I'm off to get married and have children. I mean, this
Yes,
is
but you
amazing.
forget that when I went into the 50s, now none of you have any memory or history of what the 50s was like for women, because they had to leave their jobs in the 1940s. Because in the 1940s we had the war going on, and all the women took over jobs. Came the 1950s, and they no longer were able to hold jobs. Instead, they went home to be the wife, or to eventually become a wife. And the thing that was very interesting at that time was women were told that the only degree that they had to worry about was their MRS degree, which was Mrs. MRS meaning to become Mrs. And this was something that just didn't just talk about it, it was just taken for granted this is what happened. And that any woman that wanted to had ambition and that did want to go out to work and do something, she was really considered mentally unstable. Plus, young men who were different were also considered, homosexuality was considered mentally unstable. So it was the women and the homosexual men were in the same boat. We were all unstable. And this went on throughout the 50s. Now remember, I went into the world, into the outside world in the 1950s, which is a very bizarre world. When I think of before feminism, now I went in 1969 is when I went to San Diego, and everything just fell apart at that point. Before I went to San Diego, I lived in Chicago, and it was there I had 4 children, which, you look at me now and you think, why on earth would someone in her position want to have 4 children? Well, I really did want to have 4 children. I just never understood that if you have children, that's a big no-no. It's motherhood, and being especially a woman artist is an impossibility. It's nonsense. It just doesn't happen. And people look at it in a very different way. Now, any male, if you look at our past history, I don't know about how many women artists there were, but there must have been some around, but obviously they did not enter the history books. Jansen's History of Art, I don't know if you've taken that up or anyone's told you about that yet, but there were no women artists in Jansen's History of Art. And yet, when I was going to school in Chicago, when a teacher told me that, oh, that is so good, that work. Your work is almost as good as a man's. I was so flattered, I cannot tell you. It was a very, very big thing for me. So, suddenly, I come out of the 60s, I go to San Diego, and it's the beginning of the Vietnam War. There was a lot of, things were up in flames. There was a lot of, in terms of our politics and what was going on around the world. And so, coming suddenly into the early 70s, late 60s, early 70s, was the beginnings of the feminist movement. And that was pretty much what it really did save my life, because there were suddenly other women around, other women artists. They weren't all men. And it was almost shocking. And when I came to New York, there was a publication on art and politics. And there were a lot of very well-known women artists. I was part of that group. And we put out publications, and we were pretty much funded, or we tried to get money as much as we could. But it was the very beginning. It was not something that's something I knew about, and yet there were lots of other women in my group, and the women artists that I knew in the group, and who were not part of it, who didn't want any part of the feminist movement. I never knew if they ever had children. Nobody ever mentioned having children. I was in that group. I never mentioned having 4 children. So that there was a funny time. And it was only later that, as time went on, when we suddenly started to ask questions like, why? What was this all about? What was this thing about motherhood, particularly, not just being a woman, but being a mother and trying to be a woman artist? And it was a taboo, and the word is taboo. So I'll just take it back.
There's also a great, this is a really great story that Ida tells about when it was before you came to New York and before your hospitalization, you were doing copper enamels and jewelries, and she entered a competition. Tell about that, because it's very, and I think for young people, it's really important to remember some of these things.
I entered a competition and got the first prize, got top prize. And they even had a little article in the paper and a picture of me, and underneath it said, Mrs. Gideon Horowitz, blah, blah. So that my name was not there, but I was Mrs. Gideon Horowitz. I was Mrs. Gideon Horowitz when I tried to get my own credit card. No, it had to be Gideon Horowitz on my credit card, and it had to say Mrs. Gideon Horowitz. Now, you guys are not familiar with this, but please remember it. There was a time.
Well, and yeah, it's just very, I find it very poignant to kind of think about that, and especially the vagina drawings, that in some ways, at least the way I see it and interpret in a way, is sort of Ida kind of claiming herself, claiming that part of her body, and it took 168 drawings to feel that possession of identity in that regard. So I think it's a really kind of beautiful thing to think about.
Absolutely. Catherine.
Yeah, my question kind of relates to some of the things you've been saying. Thank you so much for sharing your film. It's really wonderful. But one of the questions I really had watching it was how you decided what biography to share and how much to hold back, because I felt that there was a lot of really interesting material on your creative process that I really enjoyed. There's also a lot of questions I had which kind of almost beautifully held back, like what it's like to be Ida's daughter, or how it was to be a mother and a woman artist during that time. I just wondered whether you chose to kind of hold some of that back so it didn't become a portrait of somebody who had a family as well as being an artist. It felt like you've kind of chosen to sort of foreground.
I think some of it was boundaries that Ida set, okay, but it was also that this was a portrait of Ida as an artist, okay, and that was the most critically important aspect. And obviously I did not want it to be like this is about my relationship with Ida. It was really sort of who she is and what the struggles that she had to overcome to become an artist, and to own that. But obviously by virtue of me making the film, some of the questions were important to hear, and so there was some of that. It was really, for me, the editing process is hugely important, and it was done in a way that was very intuitive. I knew that it was not going to work as a linear film, and I did not want it to be a traditional film. I wanted to be guided more by emotion and certain themes, and so in a way I had no road map except that I sat there and kind of threw it all up and and was not trying to intellectualize it or force it into a structure, and so it kind of really took its form on its own in a more intuitive way.
Did you talk about those themes at the time? Were you editing over the course of the 15 years, or did you? Okay, so the film was a surprise either when you saw it, or?
When she told me that she was finished with it, and she said, I'd like you to see it. And of course, like a good mother, I said, oh, of course. And I sat there, and I really did not see it or hear it. And it's almost like when my children were very young, and I had to take them to the doctor, and say a boil had to be pierced or something, and I would blur my eyes so I didn't have to look at it. And from pretty much looking at the film the first time, I blurred my eyes and tried not to hear too much of it. Which is the way I've got to watch that film. It took me a long time.
Because it's hard material?
Pardon me?
Because it's difficult material that you are...
Because I never thought that film was going to be in existence while I was still alive.
But it's also very difficult when, I'm sure anybody here, you see yourself, on a video, on a screen, or you hear your voice and you're like, ugh, you know, and here she's seeing herself, someone who is very private, very shy, suddenly she's there for 70 minutes. You know? So it's I think just intense. Yes, it's a difficult thing.
It's still difficult for me to
Yeah.
see. And it took me a long, long time. It was at the opening, there was, I think the film opened first at the Modern.
Museum of Modern Art in New
Yes,
York.
and
Yeah.
I was sitting next to it for the first time. I said, Beth, it is a good film.
No, you said it is brilliant. Yes, because prior to that, the 2 times I showed it to her, she kind of went, "It's good," and I thought it was just a disaster to her. And then she leaned over, and it was like that. You said it was the first time you really, with an audience, was able to really see it and hear it and absorb what the film was in that regard.
Hi, I really enjoyed that. Thank you very much. I was interested in what you were saying about how you've been, your challenge with patriarchy through your work and working within that context, and obviously both of your work confronts that to some degree. I was just wondering how you think it is now, like what's changed, what's working, what's not, and what your take is on kind of women artists' position in relation to the art world now.
It's an interesting question. Part of what I always did not like was being that we have to have a label. And that's what you're actually asking me, is how do you feel for being a feminist, doing work, having a family, being in the art world. I hate the idea because it's so easy to dismiss people. You really do dismiss them when you call them a feminist, or just the way I dismiss someone that nowadays they call a racist. You know, in America we have Trump, and I dismiss him continuously. And still, when I think about the idea of being a feminist, and I am a first-generation feminist, and there are many generations after me, and right now they're very, very different in terms of the way they think and what they do, and I am calling them their mother's feminism. Very different from what they is today. But I'm very grateful, number one, that there is such a thing as feminism, and that you don't, dirty words, an F word, people don't like being called feminist, and that's a real problem. And my feeling is, I take feminism as a political position, and whatever you want to call it, you don't have to call it feminism, you can call it whatever you like, because as a woman you have no choice. And if you just sit back and say, well, I'm not a feminist, blah, blah, you're just full of shit. It's not so.
Well, it's also, we've come a certain way, but we've also got so much further to go. I mean, if you look at the number of women directors in Hollywood, you can count them on one hand. You know, it's really, it moves a little forward, then it moves back. Then a few steps forward. So I think, and with female artists as well. How many blue chip women artists are there? Well, I can't answer it, but I just think that, you know, it's really critically important to have this conversation, to keep having it, to have women understand the history, and to know that there's still so much to do, and we really need to have a voice.
One of the biggest things that, I mean, as long as I can remember, there have always been all men's shows, but they're never called a man's show. But then again, it's always all women. It's a women's show. They're going to show women. The museum is so proud right now. In 1989, I remember there was so much progress in the Museum of Modern Art. There was a really big show. 169 artists, of which 13 were women. 1989. Well, how much has progressed in that time? We're still at the point where you do not have an all-woman. I also have problems with that, all-women shows. Although women are very grateful to be in a show, to be in a museum, and to have their name and their work there. And I still resent it. I still don't want to have an all-woman show. I would like it to be an artist show and have them represented pretty equally But that's never going to happen. Not in my lifetime, and I think I can guarantee it's not going to be in your lifetime. Sorry.
Any other questions, comments?
Feelings. Any feelings?
Lucy.
I just wanted to really ask this to you, Beth, that I know you've been very clear, both of you, about your boundaries, and that it's right that it's a portrait of an artist rather than a relationship between mother and daughter. But how has this impacted on your own work in the sense of, do you think it's drawn things up for you about your own working process?
It's such a complicated question.
You don't have to answer.
No, it's just a very odd thing. I mean, Ida and I just, our work has a lot of very similar concerns, and we are often informed about what each other's doing, and then often we are uninformed about what we are doing. And so I think that there's sort of this unsaid influence that we've had on each other. We came to New York City to become artists at the same time. I was 19 and Ida was, I don't want to get the 44. And so we were coming there really at the same time, and because we're close, there's a lot of dialogue about themes and what is she reading, what I'm reading, researching and such. But there's kind of an interesting story about the vagina drawings, which maybe speaks to that question, and I'll just tell that, and then maybe you can imagine the rest. But I did a series of portraits of women's vaginas, and they were photographs in 1995. I knew nothing about Ida's drawings of the vaginas that she did in 1969, because when she did them in 1969, she obviously was not advertising to her children after she put them to bed, I'm going to go in the bathroom and do some drawings of my vagina. So we never knew about these drawings, and she boxed them up, put them in the basement. And so it wasn't until 2008?
2008.
She
just leaving out one incident.
Oh, yes, okay.
One incident was that at some point she was showing me the vagina, her vagina drawings.
the photographs, the photos I had done. Yes.
And I totally had forgotten that I had these vagina drawings in the boxes in the basement. And I remembered that I had, there was a folder, I don't know how about there were 2 vagina drawings in there. And I said, you know, but that's so funny, because I think I also had done some vagina drawings, and I was not at all, and did not understand that I had done them. And I showed them to her, and she said, it's so funny, I am doing this and you have done that. And
the number of years in between, and not knowing. And so obviously, you know, we have similar concerns. We express them in very different ways, different mediums, but it's, you know, and that's why it's sort of this wonderful sort of, she's of one generation, I'm of another generation. I express it, I think, very much in sort of maybe the style of my generation. Sometimes it's maybe a little more confrontational, aggressive, provocative,
yes.
But yes, there's obviously a large history, she calls it genetics, I don't know, it's of interweaving of similar concerns, yes.
You both touch on issues of giving people a voice, or topics a voice that wouldn't necessarily traditionally have a voice. We now live in a world which is very technologically driven. There are more people who have a voice than ever before, with Twitter and YouTube and all that sort of great stuff, but in many ways it's also given people a voice who maybe shouldn't have a voice. Such as Donald Trump. But I'm just wondering, in terms of feminism and moving the sort of issues forward, how do you think that's going to affect things going forward? Obviously, like you've already expressed, you don't think that our generation will see sort of equality, as it were. How do you think that's going to affect the way that the sort of feminism movement?
Yeah, talking about technology and what's happened recently. It will go so much swifter, I hope, but I don't know. You seem to think that it probably will go much faster than it's gotten before, than it has before. And I watch younger people today, and I'm shocked by what they can come up with much more quickly than I could in a million years, even with whatever I believe in and different kind of concerns. But what you bring up would be very interesting to see what happens, because I think it will. It absolutely will. And I'm wrong then in terms of what I said. I don't think it will change. But perhaps you're right. I hope you're right.
I think absolutely, because now the technology, you just turn on your phone. And there are so many really powerful young women who are on YouTube saying things that, you know, are very uncensored and done in a way and a style of a very young generation. And, you know, I even see my daughter who's 13, you know, she does all this announcing, you know, on YouTube, and I'm sometimes very shocked, and I'm also like, oh, I don't know if this is okay. And I realize it's what you're saying. I mean, hopefully we hear more of the powerful young feminist voices as opposed to the Trump followers' voices. But I do think that it allows for a much greater dialogue, because you don't have to have, you know, you don't have to have the expensive equipment to actually broadcast, and have also the validation of a broadcaster to have your voice heard. So I think that's a really good question. Thanks.
Now I realise that we've got to 8 o'clock, but I'm also aware that there's 2 people that have put their hands up and I haven't. So I'd like you to ask your questions. Kate, you had one and you had one here. So let's have your questions.
I was interested the fact that you both made the vagina, you used the vagina as a subject, but Ida, you obviously were using drawing, and it's interesting, coming from Drawing Room, which is the organisation that I'm involved with. I mean, how do you feel? Could you imagine now taking the same subject and using your iPhone? I mean, what do the drawings do that the photographs couldn't do?
That's an interesting question, and I really don't know. I couldn't really tell you. I'm too old. I only became acquainted with the I was never going to have email. I was never going to have a computer. This is 2001. Okay? And I had to do a print one time, and they asked me, how do you want this? And he said, I can do it with a computer. We can do it digitally. And I thought, well, okay, let's see how that goes. And then I watched him with this one push of a button, which would take me months to try and do in a painting. And he did that all, it was all done very swiftly. At which point I went to Apple Workshop, registered there, and decided I was going to start figuring out how to use a computer and to do Photoshop and do all these things. And I started to work. And I do a lot of printing now, on a huge printer. And, but that happened very, very late for me. That's why I say I'm too old for any innovations at this point.
But you draw. Drawing is still what you do.
Oh, drawing is still what I do all the time.
I wondered if Beth had always referred to Ida by her first name, or was that something in the public sphere?
You know, whether I always refer to you as Ida or if it's just in the public sphere.
That's an interesting question.
It kind of, you know, it kind of goes back and forth. I mean, it's true more in private. I might call her Mom, but sometimes in private I call her Ida. But in public, in this situation, I would always call her Ida. So sometimes Mom slips out, but most of the time it's been so many years that I've called her Ida. But in, you know, privacy, I always refer to her as Mom.
And I have many grandchildren, and they all call me Ida.
You would not allow them to call you Grandma, that's why.
And that's true.
Well, on that note, I'm going to ask us to thank Beth and Ida, but just to first of all invite you down one floor to the seminar room 1, where we're going to go and have a glass of wine. If you have any other questions that you would like to maybe ask in a less formal setting, then please do that. We're going to head down there. So if you don't know where to go, follow someone who's walking with confidence, but it's just one flight down on this side of the building, and we'll come down and join you there. But first, let's thank Beth and Ida for